Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Day 4 of the World Affairs Councils of America's 2020 National Conference, New Frontiers in Diplomacy and National Security. I'm Bill Clifford, President and CEO of WACA, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this special think tank briefing with members of the Council on Strategic Risks. CSR is a DC-based think tank specializing in the topic that we're going to discuss today: systemic security risks and solutions, biological, climate, and nuclear threats. I'm going to introduce our four panelists and we'll get right to it. Christine Parthemore is CEO of CSR, and she's a founding board member of the think tank. She and her colleague Andy Weber just wrote an article, an op-ed in the Los Angeles Times about COVID and how it may incentivize countries to explore biological weapons. Andy Weber is the senior fellow and director on Center for the Strategic Weapons, Center on Strategic Weapons. He spent decades in government, including as Assistant Secretary of Defense for nuclear, chemical, and biological defense programs. John Conger is director for the Center on Climate Security. He too has served in the Pentagon, including as Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense, Comptroller. Natasha Bajema, Dr. Natasha Bajema, knows us from, I think, the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan. She's also a senior fellow, and she is the founder and CEO of Nuclear Spin Cycle, a consultancy that works in national security, entertainment, and publishing. These four experts are going to take your questions at the second half of the hour, and I'll turn it over to Christine now to get us underway. The topic again is systemic security risks and solutions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bill. And thanks for everyone who's joining us today into the World Affairs Councils for having us. I'm Christine Parthemore. As Bill said, I'm the CEO of the Council on Strategic Risks. CSR's mission is to anticipate, analyze, and address systemic risks to security in the 21st century. While there are countless security threats in the United States and around the world that we're all confronting, CSR is unique in our focus on strategic and systemic risks. So in other words, those threats for which the consequences are so grave and that are so core to the world order as we know it, that they can dramatically alter the political, economic, and social systems that form the foundation of our international security and stability. We're living through this now. The COVID-19 pandemic has triggered systems failures that we could foresee and were foreseen, unfortunately, but for which the nation and many others around the world did not adequately prepare. The effects on our security are stark. In addition to the devastation of 250,000 lives lost just within this country and millions sickened, COVID-19 has showed the vulnerability of our security and foreign policy institutes to biological threats and other systemic risks. It took down an aircraft carrier, it took an aircraft carrier offline, required quarantine of most of the Joint Chiefs after one single exposure event that they experienced. It's infected more than 100,000 defense personnel, and it's further strained relationships between the United States and many other countries around the world, including many of our close allies. For CSR, much of our work addresses the greatest of such risks, biological threats, whether they occur naturally, by accident, or intentionally through biological weapons, the climate crisis and its dramatic effects on security and stability that we're already seeing around the world today, and nuclear threats, which are growing and also becoming more complex at the same time. These are the issues that we're going to focus on in today's discussions. They're challenges that profoundly shape foreign and security policies and their execution for our country and others, and addressing them is critical to U.S. leadership in the world. But there's good news pertaining to the solutions part of today's discussion. First, these are known threats. So we understand the scale and character of biological and climate and nuclear threats that we're facing today. We know what these threats look like and what they're doing to our societies and our security. Second, they're solvable. So we deliberately included the solutions portion to tell you a little bit about the work that we're doing at CSR and that we envision should assist in directing U.S. policy toward a safer and more stable future. At CSR, our team is focused on gathering ideas for concrete steps like these to address the threats. And I'm so grateful for my colleagues who will share some of their ideas with you today, who Bill introduced. We'll conclude, going in third, and this will be Dr. Natasha Bajema, who will cover nuclear threats, which is appropriate because I first met her when she was working on nuclear weapons issues in the Pentagon. Preceding her will be John Conger, head of our Center for Climate and Security, on those set of risks. But kicking off today will be Andy Weber, who I would add was also Deputy Coordinator for the International Response to the Ebola crisis in 2014 to 2015 for the State Department, and has unique perspectives on biological threats and solutions, which he's going to cover for you now. Andy, over to you.
Thank you, Christine. I'm going to say a few things about biological threats, although we're living through the biggest biological event in my lifetime, so I'm not sure I have to say too much on the threat side. But right now we're dealing with a novel, emerging, naturally emerging virus, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and the COVID-19 pandemic that it's causing. It's been 100 years since we've had a pandemic this grave, but they probably will be occurring more frequently, given the trends with climate change and the increased human-animal interface and just global travel, the interconnectedness. One aspect that does not receive as much attention as the naturally emerging biological threats are deliberate or bioweapons threats, potential bioattacks. And this is something that's very personal to me. In fact, 25 years ago, I led a small secret US team on the first visit to the world's largest anthrax weapons factory in newly independent Kazakhstan. It was built in the 1980s during the late Soviet period, but ended up on the territory of independent Kazakhstan. And that one facility was capable of producing and loading onto weapons 300 metric tons of anthrax agent during a wartime mobilization period. So, in fact, that was a life-changing event for me. And that day I vowed that I would spend the balance of my career working on biological threats. So how do we look at this? We have the illegal nation-state biological weapons programs. Countries like North Korea have an advanced biological weapons program. We have continuing concerns about Russia having a smaller scale bioweapons program and several other countries. So there's the nation-state threat. Then there's the potential for biological terrorism for small groups or even individuals to develop and deploy biological weapons. And the overall trends for both, I think, are of an increasing threat picture, in part because of the democratization of technology. We hear a lot about the ability to read, write, and edit DNA. And it's really extraordinary how much progress is being made in biology, but that's also making it more accessible. So now we don't have to worry just about traditional biological weapons agents like anthrax, plague, and others, the Ebola, Marburg, hemorrhagic fever viruses. We also have to worry about the deliberately bioengineered weapon. So think about how much worse COVID would be if it had been a bioengineered weapon. We now have 2 to 3% mortality. Imagine if that were 30%, like smallpox, or even 50% if bioengineering were used to enhance the virulence. We're barely coping with the current crisis, so it could be much worse in the future. So that's the scary side. What I want to talk to you about is the solution that we at the Council on Strategic Risks are promoting. We, first of all, think we need to start with the right vision. And our vision is making bioweapons obsolete and also making this the last pandemic. And we think that's within our grasp. And how would we do that? By having a strong system of early warning of biological events so we can nip epidemics in the bud even before they start. And that is being powered by the ubiquity and falling price of genetic sequencing capabilities. Increasingly, full genome sequencing of viruses and bacteria will be used in day-to-day clinical diagnostics. In other words, you won't just test a sample to see if it does or doesn't have the coronavirus. You'll be able to test a sample for everything in that, for hundreds or even thousands of potential pathogens, including the novel and unknown ones, quickly and cheaply. And all of that information can then feed a global pathogen map, a real-time map, so we can really track the movement of infectious disease. And then what else is new? You know, the Department of Defense and some of the programs that I was involved with, we were concerned about the deliberately bioengineered weapon. And therefore, because it's an unknown, it will be by definition something you've never dealt with before. You need a rapid countermeasure capability, medical countermeasure capability. And that can be informed by the genetic sequence of whatever pathogen you discover. And we saw this play out real time, actually for the first time in our lives with, for example, the mRNA vaccines that are having what looks to be spectacular success. On the 11th of January, a laboratory in China posted the genetic sequence of SARS-CoV-2, and within weeks or even days, the prototype vaccines were developed from these companies which had been supported by DARPA at the Department of Defense into prototype vaccines. And the reason for the lag in the availability of these is because this is the first time they're being proven out in humans with large-scale clinical trials. There are also therapeutics, antibody therapeutics that are informed by sequence information. So while this year it was 11 months, combined with manufacturing, cell-free manufacturing capabilities, think 3D printers for biologics that are no longer just science fiction, but are enabled by the revolution in biotechnology, we can reduce that time from 11 months down to 1 or 2 months, or perhaps even weeks. And that's where we need to posture ourselves. And by having this type of a system for detecting and responding to any biological threat, we think that it will convince countries that pursuing biological weapons, if they don't have a biological weapons program, or continuing one if they do, would be fruitless, that they would not be effective in causing mass casualties, and that hopefully they will stop pursuing biological weapons or not pursue biological weapons as a result. So we call that deterrence through preparedness. And then we need this sustained public-private partnership. Public funding has been very episodic for preventing pandemics. We lurch from crisis to complacency. And we are going to continue to work to influence the United States and other governments to invest more in this system of robust biological defense capacity. And we think it's important that the national security structures, the Department of Defense, be involved in this effort because of the tremendous intellectual and scientific and financial resources that they bring to this problem. And finally, because this is the World Affairs Council meeting, I want to talk a little bit about, close and talking a little bit about the international response, because under this current administration, it's been a very US-centric response so far. But I was involved in 2014 in helping President Obama mobilize a coalition of over 70 countries to respond to the Ebola crisis in West Africa. And it was extraordinary what you can accomplish. And we have to deal with this as a global problem because viruses don't need visas and they spread so quickly. So an outbreak anywhere is a threat everywhere by definition. We created the Global Health Security Agenda with over 75 countries participating in it, specifically for this purpose of building up public health capacity to detect and prevent and respond to pandemics. So, pulling out of the WHO during a pandemic is exactly the wrong direction. We need to reassert U.S. global leadership in this area and work with allies and partners and even adversaries on this common problem of biological threats. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. And that's certainly another cross-cutting theme across all the issues we're touching on today is the United States pulling back from international institutions and treaties across all of these issues. That includes, of course, the threat to pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement. So getting over to the climate crisis and what that means for security for the United States and internationally, we'll turn it over to John Conger.
Hey, good afternoon. Thanks for having me, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about climate change and why this is a national security issue. A lot of the conversations that I have in Washington and around the country, and frankly around the world, people are wondering why do you consider this to be a security issue in the first place? It's clearly an environmental issue. It's clearly an economic issue, and it's a health issue too. But where we look at is the security implications of all of that. And if there was one takeaway that I want everybody to have today as you walk away is that climate change is a national security issue, and it's not just a future national security issue, it's one that's happening today. When we think about climate change and the debates in Washington that we've had over the years, a lot of it sort of devolved into science. Is it real? Is it not real? Are all these changes going to happen, or is it, some fantasy? The fact of the matter is that I'm not going to have a scientific debate with anyone, but 99% of the climate scientists say this is real, and here's the projection. There's a very clear amount of foresight that we have as to what the changes are going to be in the climate going forward based on the emissions profiles that we have today. So I'm not going to question them any more than I'm going to question a doctor that says that cigarettes cause cancer. It is the same thing. So let's put the science aside and think about what are the implications of all of this. So as you contemplate the security issues that we deal with, and I think about it from a DoD perspective. When I was in the Department of Defense, I had to deal with the climate change issue, and why would the military care? Well, there's a few sort of large categories of issues, and I'll go through several of those, and there's going to be more, but these will be the highlights, things you might want to remember. One is the implications for stability around the world. You've got food security issues, water scarcity issues. You've got economic displacement, and that leads to tension and sometimes conflict. And in some places, you get migration dynamics as well. All of those things drive instability. If you talk to commanders, in the Pentagon, four stars who have been out there in Central Command or Southern Command, Pacific Command, the thing that they're going to think about first and foremost when they have to think about climate change is the instability that it drives in the nations that they have responsibility in those regions. They don't, in thinking through what does drought do to a nation's economy, and does it drive agricultural folks to the cities, and does do increasing number of unemployed folks in urban areas create more instability and potential conflict or civil war? I mean, that's sort of what happened in Syria. I won't say climate change caused the Syrian civil war, but as an ingredient to this mix. You get people thinking about, all right, I have to think about things in those terms. I have people deployed now to Syria. How did they get there? What could we have done in advance in this context? So instability around the world, that it is a driver of that. It's not the only cause, it is a driver of it. So commanders, 4 stars, combatant commanders are going to think about it in those terms. Second, infrastructure. Clearly, climate change has infrastructure impacts. I used to have responsibility for military installations around the world. And one of the most sort of tangible and immediate impacts of climate change is you see infrastructure impacts, whether it's flooding at a base or wildfires driving people to evacuate an installation, or hurricanes that level a base. So at Tyndall Air Force Base in the panhandle of Florida, a couple of years back, we had Hurricane Michael, which essentially took down the entire base. People had to leave. There were no lives lost at the base, but about $5 billion worth of infrastructure damage. Not that long after, or actually it was long before, was Hurricane Florence in North Carolina, which did about $3.5 billion of infrastructure damage at Camp Lejeune, a Marine Corps base on the coast there. So as you start to think through all of these impacts, and I can rattle off other examples with other billion-dollar price tags, but the point is when you start talking about $1 billion here and $1 billion there, or 3 or 5 billion, Congress starts to pay attention, because that's real money. And so, I didn't have to do a whole lot more convincing of people in Congress that climate change was having national security implications when they had to start writing checks for rebuilding bases from these impacts. And so you can call it climate change, or you could just call it climate. But the fact of the matter is that Mother Nature has a mighty wallop and is having significant impacts on the ability of our military to be able to respond, because every time you take down a base, you are sort of undermining readiness, and you are undermining training and so on. So think in terms of infrastructure and readiness as a more immediate impact, certainly one with big dollar signs that we have to be thinking about. The third category, and the last sort of main bucket I'm going to talk about is great power competition. There's nothing that gets Congress paying attention more and the Pentagon paying attention more than when you talk about great power competition. Well, it takes nothing but a look up to the Arctic to see a whole new ocean opening up, Russia moving their military up to sort of project power into this new region, and to think, are we ready to be able to ensure freedom of the seas and freedom of navigation through these areas? How are we going to reposture in an ice-free Arctic, or an Arctic that's ice-free part of the time? China has declared itself now a near Arctic nation. They have more icebreakers than the United States. So these are things that sort of get the attention. So we're building more icebreakers now. We're at least programming for them. We'll get the icebreakers in many, many years, but that we're starting to think in those terms. The Arctic becomes sort of a focal point with resources and trade routes, and frankly, nations bristling with power and large militaries who are going to be in proximity to each other in that region as it opens up. So we think about all these different pieces. There's the instability and the more fragile nations on one side. There's the great powers on the other side. There's, frankly, infrastructure both here at home and abroad. And all of those dynamics drive us to be concerned about the fact of the matter is that climate change is affecting everything around us, and it is a national security issue. Now, I was supposed to talk about solutions at some point here. I'm not going to rattle off too much more because I know that the time is running short. I'll take like a minute to say, we have a document called the Climate Security Plan for America. We published it on our website, and it was endorsed by dozens and dozens of senior retired military officials, including 8 4-star generals and admirals. And it has a lot of different recommendations in sort of 4 categories. I'll rattle off the categories and we can talk about more details in a sec. Demonstrating leadership and sort of organizing the security apparatus to deal with this is one. Second is sort of using the foresight that we have to assess and to plan to understand your vulnerabilities so you can counter them. The third is supporting our partners and allies, giving resilience to those fragile nations that could devolve into instability. And fourth is planning for preparing ourselves and doing some work on prevention as well of climate change in the future, because it is clearly a national security issue. Again, I'm going to make sure that you take that away. National security and climate change are very interconnected. The military's bought into it for a very long time. And so that's not an issue of politics, and it's an issue of pragmatism. I'll stop there and hand it over to Natasha.
I'll do the quick segue though between you two as well. One of the topics that we're working on through our Converging Risk Lab, of which Natasha's our director as well, and one of the hats that she wears, is pulling on what John's talking about and building on what Natasha's going to talk about, is how climate change is affecting nuclear weapons possessing states. And that includes their stability, as some of them, such as India and China and others, are getting really slammed by the effects of climate change already, and it's going to get worse. In addition to issues of great power competition in the Arctic and other places like John mentioned. So we'll give a plug that Natasha put out a full video series with one more coming, touching on this nexus of climate change and nuclear weapons possessing states that we have on our YouTube channel and online. Getting into nuclear weapons threats and nuclear threats specifically, then we'll turn it over to Natasha.
Thanks, Christine. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me. So unlike climate change and bio threats, the risk of nuclear weapons is largely occurring under the radar of most Americans. But we've reached a troubling point of inflection for the risk of nuclear war. It appears to be rising sharply rather than gradually receding as it has done in the past few years. There are several factors at play. Most obviously, there's still a very large number of nuclear weapons, each of them capable of unimaginable destruction. There's approximately 13,400 nuclear warheads spread across the 9 nuclear weapon states. Together, the US and Russia are responsible for 91% of these. So although we're down from a peak number of about 70,000 weapons in 1986, there's still much work to be done. And as long as large numbers of these weapons exist, we'll continue to face an unacceptable risk of nuclear conflict, accidents, unauthorized use, and escalation. Second, we are witnessing the collapse of US-Russia arms control. US-Russian reductions in nuclear weapons have undergirded global nuclear nonproliferation efforts and strategic nuclear deterrence for many decades. However, the US withdrew from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, INF, in August 2019 in the face of Russian noncompliance. And as of November 22, in just a few days, the US will no longer be party to the Open Skies Treaty, not an arms control treaty, but an important confidence building measure. New START, the last arms control agreement between the US and Russia, is going to expire on February 5, 2021. That's in a few months, if not renewed for another 5 years. If this treaty expires, the current limits at 1,550 nuclear warheads on 700 strategic delivery systems, there will be no more limits. Russia and US will be free to do what they will. Third, there are many signs of a destabilizing arms race amongst the great powers. The US, China, and Russia are racing to build hypersonic weapons with unparalleled speed and maneuverability. These weapons offer the ability to defeat state-of-the-art missile defense, but also they provide the element of surprise, which is incredibly destabilizing. All of these countries are also competing to use AI or autonomous weapons for warfare. This promises to increase the speed of warfare over time and compress the already very short decision-making windows for launching nuclear weapons should a nuclear conflict arise. We're also seeing the development of many new nuclear weapons. Russia has boasted the development of a nuclear-armed torpedo called the Poseidon. It's an 80-foot long nuclear-powered submersible robot that carries a 2-megaton nuclear warhead. Essentially, it's an underwater ICBM. It's designed to travel autonomously, carrying a nuclear warhead, across thousands of miles and detonate an enemy coastal city and destroy it with a tsunami. Russia claims the torpedo is a retaliatory weapon, so second strike weapon. Meanwhile, the US has deployed low-yield nuclear weapons on its ballistic missile submarines. These 5 to 8 kiloton ballistic warheads have been fit onto Trident II missiles, which also happen to deliver 90 kiloton and 455 kiloton yield nuclear weapons. The Trump administration claims that these weapons fill a capability gap for deterring Russian aggression with tactical nuclear weapons. However, when deployed on a strategic delivery system, they can lead to dangerous miscommunication and miscalculation. If you can imagine the US were to launch a ballistic missile armed with a low-yield nuclear weapon from a submarine, Russia would have to assume the worst case scenario. Adding to this potential for miscalculation, the US also plans to deploy new nuclear air and sea launched cruise missiles. Unlike ballistic missiles, cruise missiles are dual capable. They can carry both nuclear and conventional weapons. Again, this leads to the possibility for miscommunication and miscalculation. Last but not least, the context around nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence is growing increasingly complex with the emergence of new technologies. And these are raising significant questions for the continued effectiveness of strategic nuclear deterrence. For example, social media. Communication and perception are essential elements to maintaining deterrence among adversaries. However, today's leaders now are communicating over social media as a way to conduct international diplomacy. Could a tweet lead to nuclear conflict? That question's uncomfortable and it's unanswered. Outer space. Our entire nuclear deterrence system relies on outer space, which has become more populated with space objects and junk by many more countries, but also the private sector. Satellites are increasingly vulnerable to destruction and disruption, both accidental and intentional. And we rely upon these satellites for early warning, for detection, and other things that are vital to nuclear deterrence. Automation. Nuclear weapons have always relied upon some level of automation, but as these systems are modernized and brought up to date, they're likely to have more digital components that are networked. These electric components will face some of the same cyber vulnerabilities as a computer connected to a network. Finally, over the next 10 years, we're going to see the ever increasing integration of AI or machine learning wherever data and automation play a role. So there will be a growing temptation to do the same with nuclear weapon systems, not only introducing new risks associated with AI, but also exacerbating cyber vulnerabilities. The risk of war, nuclear war, is on the rise. This trend line is due to a lack of a sustained commitment to reducing the risks of nuclear weapons and these other factors that create greater potential for miscommunication, miscalculation, and escalation. So I painted a pretty dire picture. It doesn't have to be this way. After many decades of reducing nuclear risks, we know how to get this done, and CSR plans to be on the forefront of helping to solve these problems. Thank you.
Thanks, Natasha. I echo that sentiment wholeheartedly and agree with everything you said as well. I'll encourage viewers to send questions in the chat box that will come over to us over the next couple of minutes, but I'm going to take the opportunity to send the first question out to the group from our side. So Natasha, on that front, since you said we know how to do this, we know how to reduce some of these nuclear threats, and I know you've been working on some of those specific ideas. We'll start with you and then go to John and then Andy. Getting to the solution side again, are there 1 to 2 specific things that the next administration, when they come into office in January, should prioritize?
Well, the top priority must be renewing the New START treaty with Russia. We don't have much time to do that. I think it should be a no-brainer. Russia seems to want that, and so I would put that as number 1. And I think the second major priority has to be kind of a more long-term priority, and that is reimagining arms control as we've done it in the past. So in the past, we focused on reducing the numbers of weapons, but reducing numbers doesn't always reduce risk. And it also, by talking in terms of numbers, prevents us from expanding arms control to involve other countries like China, for example. And so at CSR, we want to move to risk reduction, move away from numbers to risk reduction. And we're developing a framework to get us there. And we're calling it a Code of Nuclear Responsibility, which is based on 10 commitments to nuclear strategic stability. So a number of quick measures that we could do is stop blurring the lines between conventional and nuclear. So looking at cruise missiles in particular and taking the nuclear out of that calculation so we don't have a miscalculation. And then also we need to really think through the new complexities that surround nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence and make sure that we've thought through all of the potential scenarios.
Absolutely. Thanks, Natasha. And John, a couple of specifics pulling from the climate security plan for America and other sources.
Sure. I mean, if you wanted to get at climate change in the big picture and put your arms around the entire globe, you're going to have to try and get the world to net zero emissions by, as soon as possible, right? Otherwise, you're going to just keep adding and adding and adding to the problems. If we're thinking about what we can do in this administration in the near term, I'd throw out 2 things. One, as soon as possible, rejoin Paris and rejoin the sort of global discussion. And this is a security reason for the non-obvious reason that American leadership is important to our national security. If we sort of leave a power vacuum, then others around the world are going to move into it. And that is going to change the dynamics and the relationships we have with nations that we need to have these positive relationships with. So get back into Paris and become a good global citizen, as it were. These are voluntary goals inside of that agreement. So it's not like it's going to cost a single job or anything like that to rejoin the agreement. It just puts us back at the table and part of the discussion to be constructive with everybody else. I think the second thing that we need to do, like on day one or in the first 100 days or whatever it is of the next administration, is to have the White House direct the creation of a whole of government climate security strategy and plan. There are bits and pieces of this floating around at DoD and it's the State Department and so on. But thinking about climate change as a national security issue, coming up with a strategy to address those problems. And let me just say, mitigation is important. The emissions are important, but thinking about emissions is half a strategy. We have decades of bad things that are going to happen to us that we've already sort of set the table for by the emissions we've already made. And we have to be prepared to deal with those things. We have this responsibility to prepare. And so coming up with a holistic strategy across the State Department, the Defense Department, the intelligence community, DHS, and bringing it all together into something coherent to protect the country and our interests from the environment. Yeah, so it's not just protecting the environment, it's protecting ourselves from the environment. And having that strategy placed and put in place at the beginning of the administration so that people have years to implement would be the front kind of thing I would do.
Thanks, John. And over to Andy, and then we'll turn to some of the viewers' questions.
Well, President-elect Biden on day one is going to have to deal with the pandemic, and that's reactive. That's managing the crisis. But around the same time, in early February, he will be issuing his first budget. So I think there's an opportunity to show in that budget that we're going to work towards this vision of making bioweapons obsolete. I'll give you a specific example that most people don't realize, that in this year's budget, President Trump and former Secretary of Defense Esper cut the Department of Defense Chemical and Biological Defense program that develops medical countermeasures for these types of diseases by 10%. I mean, it's unimaginable. This was, as the pandemic was already lurking in China. So we need to reflect a priority on reducing biological threats in the budgets of the Department of Defense and the Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Homeland Security. That's one. The other is, most people on this call, I'm sure, remember that President Obama gave an amazing speech on nuclear threats in Prague in early April of 2009, his first few months in office. And the intent of that was to mobilize the world around a series of policies and actions to reduce nuclear dangers. What we need President Biden to do early in his administration is to give a Bio-Prague speech where he will reassert United States leadership and partnership with our allies and partners around the world on this vision of making bioweapons obsolete and making this the last pandemic. And I think that's just a tremendous opportunity to use our imagination and to leverage the incredible revolution in biotechnology to make us all safer. Specifically, one of the things on nuclear security that President Obama did was he kicked off a series of nuclear security summits that were hosted by the United States twice, by the Republic of Korea, and by the Netherlands. I think we need, at the leadership level, not at the health minister level, but at the leadership level, a series of high-level meetings on biological threats that can be rotated, perhaps starting in Washington or Geneva and then moving to other countries. But that's a way to elevate the priority to get not just traditionally weak and underfunded health ministries to the table, but also finance ministers, defense ministers. And we need, as John said, with climate, we need to define pandemics as a national security imperative. To be honest, the Pentagon is reluctant. The intelligence community is reluctant to even get involved in preventing and preparing for pandemics because they view this as perhaps something that HHS and CDC should be dealing with. And it's not the traditional focus on kinetic warfare that is what DoD knows so well and is in the comfort zone. So having that presidential leadership will be key as we move forward to a world that is safer against biological threats.
Thanks, Andy. And on that note, I would plug again our piece last week in the Los Angeles Times that if anyone doesn't think that pandemics in general are a defense problem, which obviously they are, and a security issue for our nation, at very least, we have to worry much more significantly now about the threat of biological weapons deliberately used as an ill-informed lesson from some of the missteps that have been made in the pandemic response. So would echo all of that. We'll turn now to some of the readers, or some of the viewers' questions that we have coming in. One of the first ones that came in is whether, that I'd be curious for any one of you to answer, whoever would like to jump in, is whether we view inequality also as a national security threat, similar to how we treat climate change and some of these other sort of pervasive issues.
I'll jump in with that. So my answer to that is absolutely. And I think if you look at just inequality across the national security field, which is dominated by a certain kind of person, perspectives, if you come from the same place in your life, you have the same perspective. We don't get a full range of the perspectives that the US has to offer. And so we don't get all of the innovation that we need, all of the solutions that we need to solve these daunting problems. And so not having everyone have a seat at the table is a national security threat.
I'll add 2 cents to that. I tell you what, I've been and Andy and I have both been in many of these meetings in the Pentagon where you look around the room of senior leaders and it's all white guys. And that's not helpful. And there's usually some women there, but the people of color, there's just a very small number, and that clearly needs to be addressed. You're not fully leveraging the capabilities of your country if you don't leverage all the different views. It is to your disadvantage.
I would just wholeheartedly agree with both of you, and having represented our country abroad, our greatest strength is in our diversity, period. And so we need to make increasing diversity in the government service a priority.
Thank you. I would add as well, on one of the specific sides for addressing it, and some of how we're thinking about our work on preventing future pandemics and addressing biological threats writ large, you clearly have to address some of the systemic inequalities and inequities in our country. In order to do that, we're seeing starkly how different people of different classes, economic strata, geographies, racial and ethnic backgrounds are being affected differently by some of those systemic inequalities in our country. And that's a huge threat. And again, it's a threat to the individual Americans and people who are suffering, but you can see how it exacerbates other schisms within our society as well, and has risen a lot of social strains to the top of people's mind and led people out into the streets protesting. So the security implications of not including addressing inequality in all of the solutions that we put forward is pretty apparent and stark, and part of what we're thinking about in terms of the solution side as well. There is a specific question next. There are a few nuclear ones that were thrown out. One specific one was addressed to you, Natasha, but we'll throw it open if anybody else wants to answer. And that was, we didn't mention North Korea so far in the nuclear broader discussions, whether you have any thoughts on our approach to that.
Well, that's a big dilemma. And I think there are a lot of people who, are struggling to answer that question. I think, looking over this past administration, there's been a lot of talk, but not a lot of, movement. And I think some of the talk has not been conducive to moving forward with North Korea. I'll pass this over to Andy to see if he has any specific suggestions from his time at Pentagon.
I would throw in as well, Andy, one of the hooks on this as well. We're concerned about North Korea having nuclear weapons, but also biological and chemical weapons, and an integrated approach to those and their conventional forces for how they might go about conducting conflict. That obviously plays into what we could do to deter them and to walk them back as well. So, Andy, curious for your thoughts, but also you might include chemical and biological threats in that as well as nuclear.
Well, sure. Well, one thing that is just a fact, in the last 4 years, the nuclear threat from North Korea has gotten worse. Their missile and nuclear weapons programs continue to expand. They haven't been as provocative in terms of their missile launches and nuclear weapons tests, but they are building up their nuclear arsenal and their missile arsenal. I would also say the situation in Iran after we pulled out of the JCPOA is getting worse. It's not near a crisis stage yet, but we need to figure out how to get that cap that prevented Iran from developing nuclear weapons, how to get that back into place if we can. In terms of biological threats, I worry a lot about North Korea. I worry about the covert use of biological weapons. We have seen both North Korea and now twice the Russian Federation using chemical weapons, not biological weapons, but using chemical weapons in covert attacks, in both cases for the purpose of assassination. And that is very dangerous, that the norm against the use of these weapons of mass destruction is breaking down. On the positive side, one of the things I'm proudest of that we accomplished while I was serving as President Obama's Assistant Secretary of Defense, we created a joint exercise program that lasted for 5 years with South Korea that was focused on responding to a biological event in South Korea, presumably a covert attack from North Korean agents on Seoul and other critical ports and airfields in the South. And through that whole of government to whole of government engagement involving, on the Republic of Korea side, over 18 different agencies of their government, including the Korea CDC, which was normally not part of their national security community. And on our side, senior leaders from different parts of the Defense Department, Homeland Security, Health and Human Services, the CDC director, FEMA. We practice this whole of government response. And indeed, South Korean leaders have said recently that that exercise series is one of the reasons that they've done so well against COVID-19.
Thank you. Yes, and that lesson is led also to some of our work on trying to elevate biological weapons as perhaps the first class of weapon of mass destruction that you could effectively take off the table by having enough early detection and rapid response and civil defense capabilities that Andy mentioned earlier. One of the other questions that's intriguing, especially because everyone here on our team, at least part-time, lives away from Washington, which I'm actually quite proud of for CSR and for how we view solutions to global security challenges. One of the questions was how to get Middle America engaged in security issues, especially after several years in which we've seen heightened nationalism in both the rhetoric and in the United States. Natasha, why don't we go to you next, and then John and Andy, and I'll wrap up and turn to the next question.
Sure. Well, that's a huge challenge. I think our first course of action as people who, even we're not based in DC, our minds are potentially based in DC, is that we have to make these topics, these extremely complex topics, accessible to everyone. And that requires us to speak jargon free. It requires us, not to speak to the people that we speak to every day, and it's possible to do. It's hard. And our community tends to resist it a little bit. I think the other challenge that is exacerbated by the polarization that we're seeing in the United States, this notion of fake news, this notion of well, if the article supports your side, it's fake news, and the vice versa. I think we might have to get away from advocacy and get more into education and more into just, sharing the information and allowing Middle America to make their own decisions and not try to tell them how to think and to ask them what they think.
John, any insights from Pennsylvania?
I would put it this way. There's a couple different dynamics. One, we've seen some research that says if you want to talk about climate change, don't bring a scientist, bring a military person, because in a lot of the communications and as they study how you're going to view the issue, you have certain people you trust. And a scientist, aside from the fact that, I've known many scientists, I have a engineering background, but the fact of the matter is that they're not always the best communicators. Some are, but they're not always. The military folks that we bring to the table they get in the door. The people are receptive. They want to hear what they want to say, and so you get inside the shields a little bit easier. To have the conversation about the core things that you want. And I'll just throw one more thing out there, which is in the climate change context, when you tell somebody it's about dealing with the problem rather than telling them that they have to stop with their emissions and deal with their, carbon footprint or whatever, and you're talking about, hey, let me protect myself, let the military do its job, let's protect our national security from this issue. People are more willing to deal with adaptation than they are to deal with emissions reductions.
Thanks. And I'll add on this point real fast and then move on to the next question. So from my hometown, Sandusky, Ohio, that I'll give a plug for, right up on Lake Erie, through the lake you border Canada. So one of the symbols of international relations in this very small town of just over 20,000 people is that there's internationalism there that you can see if you go down to the pier. There is an American flag, an Ohio flag, and a Canadian flag, because there's so much movement back and forth right across the water with Canada, both commercially and recreationally as well. So it's not that the United States is completely isolated, and people across Middle America know that. Whether it's at trade and agriculture or commercial trade across Lake Erie or whatever it is, there's a lot of it that goes on. And I think people do care, even if it's not the top of their priority list. And people are curious and pay attention to the news all across the United States, as you can see by the World Affairs Councils having people located all across the country tuning in to learn more about global affairs as well. I think one of the things that we need to do, though, and again, that we're integrating into how we think about solutions, is that you have to mobilize people to contribute to the common good for these things. So, for some of these threats, whether it's creating a climate corps that would, work across the United States, or having everyone pitch in and learn how to contribute to, enhanced preparedness against biological threats in the sort of civil defense manner that we used to have for nuclear threats in the country. That both it pulls people into these issues, these purely global transnational issues. It shows what they can do and gives them a deeper understanding and caring about some of these issues. And indeed, we actually can't confront any of these issues without everybody contributing in some way, whether it's through politics or through direct actions that they take. The solutions aren't going to just come out of Washington. There's a lot that we could do, and I also really appreciate the question. It's very important that we use accessible outreach like Natasha was talking about and pull in these issues in ways that people care about going forward. There are a couple of specifics that have come up on the nuclear and bio side as well. Turning back to nuclear real fast, and we'll go for Andy and then Natasha for their respective positions and views on this. The New Hampshire group has pointed out that Dr. Perry, former Secretary Perry, was recently speaking about getting rid of the International Continental Ballistic Missile Forces as part of reshaping our nuclear weapons program. And this particular viewer is curious for thoughts on that.
Well, I have tremendous respect for Secretary Perry. I consider him one of my mentors. In fact, we wrote an op-ed piece together in the Washington Post right after I retired from government in 2015. on eliminating nuclear-armed cruise missiles, because those are the type of nuclear weapon that I think are the most dangerous because of the ambiguity, because they're used for both conventional and nuclear purposes, because they're undetectable. They can be launched in a surprise attack. For example, a Russian Akula-class submarine off the coast of Washington launching a decapitating strike. That's what our military planners worry most about in terms of our nuclear vulnerabilities. I don't necessarily agree with Secretary Perry on eliminating our ICBM force. I do feel that the current plan to completely start anew with our ground-based strategic deterrent, or the ICBM force, is overly ambitious and expensive. I think we can do it much more cheaply by maintaining our Minuteman III force rather than starting over with new silos and new missiles to the tune of well over $85 billion. And there's only one company that has a sole source contract to start that work. Let's find a cheaper way to do it. I would reduce our number of intercontinental ballistic missiles down to 2 wings of 150 each to 300. And then I would look for ways to increase decision times. But at least with ballistic missiles, you can detect when they're launched because of the heat they give off. And although we only have 30 minutes of flight time, roughly, that's much more than a cruise missile coming from just miles off your coastline, or launched from an aircraft just over your, just at the edge of your airspace. So I don't share the view on eliminating right away our ICBM force.
Thanks, Andy. And we'll give Natasha a minute for her view and then hand it back over to Bill for closing remarks.
Okay, well, with respect, I disagree with Andy and I agree with Bill Perry on this one. I think it is, if we're going to reduce the IBMs, eliminate them, it's going to take a long time. And one of the reasons is that these local communities their economies depend on these missile bases, and it's going to take a long time to convince them that it's not in their interest to do it. For me personally, I'm worried about artificial intelligence and machine learning and potentially integrating machine learning into nuclear weapon systems down the road, and just overall the increasing speed of warfare, which we already have pretty short decision-making windows for nuclear weapons. So I agree we should reduce any potential risk there, but I think we should eliminate them entirely. If we don't have ICBMs, we don't have that artificial window for response.
Thanks, and back over to Bill.
Thank you so much, everyone, Christine and John, Natasha and Andy. As I close, I was thinking when we discussed framing this, I thought it was going to be very ambitious to do biological, climate, and nuclear all in 1 hour, but you really got so much meat on the table for us to chew on, and it's fantastic. I know we could spend 3 hours and then 30 hours on it. I hope we can facilitate more engagements with you. I'm going to pose one final question to the panel. Since everybody in Washington is talking about the Biden's transition team and what the next administration will do, I'm curious as to how you see Congress, which can't even get the coronavirus stimulus out to the country. What role will Congress play, particularly on the issues that have some deadlines coming up right now, like the New START?
Let me just, on New START, thankfully, Congress really does not have a role in that. It was built into the treaty that there's a 5-year extension without the need for ratification. But obviously, Congress has a role. These issues should not be partisan. They are essentially pragmatic, nonpartisan issues. And so they need to be depolarized. Our Council on Strategic Risks sits in the middle. We're a nonpartisan group, and we need to work with all sides and rebuild the center. My mentor, another one was Senator Richard Lugar from Indiana, and he's a role model for me on this. And when he was chairman or ranking member, taking turns with Senator Biden as in the Foreign Relations Committee leadership, they worked very closely together on a whole range of issues, especially arms control. Unfortunately, one of the challenges is we're far away from being able to ratify any treaties, new treaties, or old treaties like the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which should be ratified, but to get 2/3 of Congress seems to be a bridge too far at this point.
Thanks so much. And farewell to Christine Parthemore. I know she had a hard stop at 3, so please, Natasha, Andy, and John, extend my thanks to her and also to you as well. It's been a great session where we've recorded it and we'll share it with you. And I hope that, again, you can visit our councils virtually and one day in person too, to talk about these issues further. Thanks so much, everybody. And to my colleagues, we have a leadership session at 4 o'clock on sustainable business planning for nonprofits. And at 6:30, we'll be discussing how women win and their role in driving nonviolent change. It's an important conversation with Farah Pandith and Dr. Nina Ansari. See you then. Thank you, everybody.